limiting admin user risk in a Windows environment, and other tips to avoid making the news. My name is Blake Regan. I am a father and husband. I started in the IT industry in 2010. Previously, I worked in the construction industry. My father was a home builder. I didn't go to college right out of high school. It wasn't for me. I went right into the building trades. I worked for my uncle's interior decorating painting company, and then built houses, did remodeling. And I carried a lot of those skills into InfoSec, particularly project management, and also kind of being able to keep track of many moving parts during a project or even incident response, right? Because as a general contractor, you need to keep all the balls that you're juggling in the air to have a successful show, right? So I started in information security in 2014. This was after I graduated with my bachelor's. I'm a hockey fanatic, fan, and player. Haven't been doing much playing because of COVID, but I've been able to get back on the ice now and then. And hopefully I got my first vaccine last week. I'll get another one and start playing again. Mountain biking and trail riding. There's not a lot of mountains in Illinois, but we do have a lot of great trail systems. And so I've been doing that for many years. I recently got back into that as, you know, an avenue. You can't go to the gym. You have to have a healthy outlet. So that's something that I do to help myself. I'm an automation enthusiast. A manager of mine gave me a challenge and said, hey, I want you to get a Raspberry Pi and I want you to make an automated USB malware scanner for our lab. And so I worked in a vetting lab at Motorola Solutions, and every day you come in, you scan your USB drive to make sure there's no malware. So I used open source tools. That is up on my GitHub. And I did have some help from a coworker who kind of helped show me how to redirect output and do different things. And that process really sparked a passion in me. I now have turned that to PowerShell. I do a lot of PowerShell automation, and I'll be sharing some of those things with you here today. As blue teamers, we need to work together and share info in order to succeed. Also a serial learner. For anybody who's new to this industry, you belong here. You belong in InfoSec. If you want to be here, you've come to the right place. Wild West Hacking Fest and Black Hills Information Security. I owe a lot to them, keeping me motivated in making work enjoyable, right? That it brought that passion back for me, a new look on the industry. And so just a little bit on my background, certifications that I hold. You know, people say certifications don't matter. I believe they do matter. You go on a journey of learning, and you learn about yourself, you learn about the topic, and you also push your limits. You know, the certs aren't easy to attain, but once you obtain that cert, it's a real confidence booster, right? And so to continue that passion, we also need to keep continuing our learning as defenders and red teamers. Red teamers, I see you, right? We're talking about blue team today, but that continual learning is important because tactics, techniques, and procedures, adversaries, control frameworks change all the time. So we need to stay relevant and informed. So today, we're going to talk about unauthorized local administrator privileges in a Windows environment. We're also going to talk about managing local administrator account credentials at scale. We will talk about protecting administrative account hashes and credentials as best we can, right? Limiting that risk. We're also going to discuss weak password policies for administrative accounts. That also applies to our normal user accounts. And we're going to talk about limiting risk from EFS ransomware. A disclaimer, PowerShell scripts referenced in my slides are available on GitHub. Before you run these in production, please run them in a test environment to make sure that you understand exactly what the script is doing. These scripts are all queries, except for the force reset lapse that will force reset lapse passwords based on a collection that you provide. Unauthorized local administrator privileges. It's like breaking through a wall, right? We set up our security boundaries, we set up our controls and our alerts to form that wall of protection for us around our environments. And when that baseline changes by an unauthorized access, it's like breaking through a wall, right? So what's the risk here? Unapproved and dangerous software installation. Now your baseline in your environment becomes unknown because you have individuals installing software to do their work or whatever it may be. We also have a user with administrative privileges is compromised that turns into instant privilege escalation, right? That's one less thing that an attacker or a red teamer needs to do is obtain that admin level privileges that kind of gives us that access to modifying local policies or settings. Unapproved configuration changes. We talked about a baseline. It's very important in incident response to understand what is normal so that you can quickly cut through the noise and figure out what is not normal, right? Alyssa Torres touched on that baseline, having that fundamental knowledge that you can quickly assess, is it worth spending effort on this next task? I believe that she referenced memory acquisition. And the damage caused by insider threat. There are these unfortunate situations that happen where someone who is trusted gets into a bad situation, whatever it may be, and there can be damage that can happen based on that, abusing that trust, right? So keeping that baseline is very important. So how do we detect this? How do we detect this unauthorized administrative privilege escalation? So a couple of things that we can do. We can track these access requests in a records management system. You know, your company can determine if you need to get access to something, you have to fill out a form. That form has to be approved. Then that access gets documented. So again, going back to the fundamentals in an incident response situation, you can validate, is this person supposed to have this access, or is this something that an account got taken over and access privileges were escalated? Also using a SIME. SIME alerts triggering on event 4732, that is a user was added to a security enabled group. That would be good to have forwarding from your Windows servers as well as your Windows workstations if you can, so that if someone gets added to the local administrators group or security enabled groups that are defined in that legacy event ID, you can get an email alert. You instantly know about it. You also have it documented. So if you have to go back in an incident and identify when this happened or correlate it to that security request form, you now have the recourse to be able to do so. If you don't have a SIME, no problem. PowerShell to the rescue. I came up with a tool to identify the members of a local group on Windows host, and we'll go over that soon. It also comes down to holding people accountable. You start alerting on this activity, and you have sysadmins in your environment that are adding people. Well, why did you add them to local administrators on an Exchange server? Well, they just needed to log on to check something. Okay, was that the best choice? No. You have that conversation, you set that culture, and you set the expectations, right? You fill out the form, it gets approved, they get added to remote desktop user, not admin. You will find that if you start monitoring this in your environment, you will get a lot of pushback at first. But that really comes into having buy-in from leadership and from your coworkers and other departments that you work with. The reason that you're monitoring this is so that you understand what is happening in your environment, not to go and watch over someone's shoulder or micromanage them. It is to be able to have eyes on actions that are taking place. Now you might say, well, I'm a red teamer and I can just shut down the Windows service or unhook event tracing for Windows and you wouldn't see this. Yes, but if you're alerting on Windows event service was stopped and then the server requires a reboot to stop that service, you can also be tipped off that that happened and then go back and look. I came up with a script that it uses WMI, and the reason for this is in large environments, often you may not have up-to-date versions of PowerShell. I believe it is PowerShell 4.0 that introduces the get local user commandlet. So if you don't have that, what can you use that's resilient and works? So WMI to the rescue. So in this example here, you'll see that we're looking at our web server and our file server. This script can generate a report for local admin, remote desktop, whatever group that you decide that you want to query. It also helps you gather a baseline. You don't know who is added out in local groups in your environment. You can use this tool to gather a baseline and then start going through and either removing access. Maybe you want to organize things in a group so that you can centrally manage them. So let's look at a little scenario here. Someone created a local account on our server named $. Now, at first glance, I use the command line a lot. So when you're on the command line, if you query net user, you'll notice that you don't see that user showing up. I believe that it's a quirk in the way that Windows identifies accounts, that if it ends in $, it's a computer or machine account, so don't show me net user. But as you see in the GUI here on the left, you see that $sign shows up, right? And if we look at our local administrator group, we also see that $sign was added there. Okay, now go back to our baseline here. Do we see $sign in here? No, we don't. So now we see that an account has been added to our web server named $sign, and this is for the local administrators group. Okay, now we need to investigate why this is. We need to go back and look at our account security request forms, look back at our SIM logs, understand when did this account get created, who authorized it. If they didn't, we've turned an event into an incident and we need to respond. So this is just showing an example of a SIM alert here. This is from QRadar, and it's just showing the trigger on the 4732 event ID. You'll notice that it shows the originating computer. It shows the security ID I've obfuscated the name of the member security ID, but the group was built-in administrators. So you get this alert, and it's time for the Autobots to roll out, right? A way to resolve this, instead of adding accounts to local administrators ad hoc and then having to go out and go to the server or use a tool to remove them, you should look at using restricted groups. Now, restricted groups through group policy allows you to assign membership in a particular local group through policy. So now you'll see here, like the default on our servers here, that domain admins are part of the administrators group on our servers OU. And you'll notice here, before we apply our policy, we have a bunch of accounts to clean up. We have $, we have Bob, Tech9, there's even a machine account in there, Shadow IT's in there. Okay, how do we clean this up? Once we apply our policy, you'll notice that the only accounts left in administrators group are the domain admins and the built-in local administrator account. Now you're setting that baseline. It's defined by policy. If someone were to add an account in there, the next policy, and one, you'd get an alert. And then number two, that next policy enforcement, that account is going to go bye-bye. Talking about remote desktop users, I mentioned someone needed to get access to a server, but we don't want to make them local admin. You can also do restricted groups for remote desktop users. So now we've created a group here. You'll see in the screenshot, limited access group. Limited access group is now a member of remote desktop users assigned by policy. Same idea here. You'll see that on the server, our host server here that's having the policy applied, there are no members in the remote desktop users group. That's by default. Once we apply our policy, you can now see that that limited access group is a member of this remote desktop users group. Now you're managing this access at scale. You're having alerts trigger on access being added. You have a record that the access was requested. That works for audit, that works for IR, it works for many scenarios. And again, these are fundamental things, right, that you should be doing or look at doing better, right, to add that visibility into your network. And so now that we've cleaned up our baseline with our remote desktop users policy, you'll see that our two member servers, web server and file server, the only members in remote desktop users are now the limited access group. And that's what we want. That's by design. So again, this is a no-no. If you decide that you think you haven't done this before and restricted groups are awesome, awesome. Do not apply restricted group administrators to domain controllers. That gives instant privilege escalation to domain administrator in the built-in administrator account. Now, when you are operating on a server as a member of the built-in administrator account, your account access actually shows up as system. So that makes it very hard to provide attribution to expected users, unexpected users, actions taken on a member host. Also, you may be adding users that do not understand the power that they hold with the domain administrator, so you want to watch out for that. And just showing right here, this is the example of the privilege escalation. We applied this restricted group policy to domain controllers OU, and we now see that Shadow IT is a member of the local administrators on the DC. Also shows the built-in administrators group there. We're going to switch into managing local account administrator account credentials at scale. So that I know of, there's two ways to do this. There's LAPS. LAPS requires a domain. LAPS is a tool from Microsoft that is free, and when configured properly, and you can also work that into your role-based access control, you are enabling a different local administrator password on every member server that this is applied to. This does not apply to domain controllers. There is a local administrator account on a domain controller, but it's the DSRM account, and it is not used unless you're doing a restore. So that doesn't apply. There's also another method that you can do with PowerShell, and this is from Jason Fossen. This takes advantage of the protect CMS message commandlet, and this is an alternative to LAPS that does not require a domain. So this is very helpful for environments that are work group, your home lab. Maybe you don't have a domain set up, but you have virtual machines and you want to have a different password on each machine, playing around with it. So what's the problem of having that same administrator account password on your member servers, member workstations? I'm sure you all have heard of Responder, which takes advantage of LLMNR NetBIOS, which is the great design from Microsoft, the latch ditch effort that if DNS fails when looking for a resource, LLMNR will shout out and say, hey, can anybody tell me who is this? Someone will reply, and will reply with an NTLM message and give up an NTLM hash. Pass the hash can happen with this. Also, cracking the hash. You may have heard of a tool called CrackMapExec by ByteBleeder. Make sure that you are supporting your open source developers that are making tools. They work very hard. I have a couple scripts on GitHub, and it is a lot of work to make sure that it looks right and is documented and you have the right license. So please keep that in mind. Getting back to the dangers here, right? We can see that there's an NTLM hash that was given. This is from a Metasploit session here, but that's the danger, right? The same password on all of your servers. Well, if I have that one, I can now escalate to different areas of your forest and work my way up to domain admin. Not good. So how do we manage this? We deploy LAPS in our domain environment, which will give us that different local administrator password on every server. We also delegate read permissions to LAPS values to your service desk, to your desk side support. It's very important for them to have, maybe not to servers, but if they're managing workstations, they're going to need to get that local admin account in certain situations where maybe a user's machine is off the network and they need to log on. So you need to delegate that as part of the role-based access control. And then the permission to reset the LAPS passwords. You only give that to a few admins. If you have LAPS set up and it's working correctly, very rarely will you need to reset the password, except under certain circumstances. So some tips and tricks with LAPS. Rename your local administrator account via group policy. If you're setting it up, you're going to be setting up a new policy. Change it from administrator. Make it something that is not easily guessable. Also, LAPS can manage that new account. So now it's not administrator, it's supervisor, whatever you come up with. Rename local guest account via group policy. Disable local guest account via group policy. These are things that come up in PCI audits, right? We're talking about, Alyssa Miller is talking about check the box compliance. This is one that you can check the box and get rid of. It's easy to do. You shouldn't need to use the guest account, and you can rename it via group policy. So why not? This is something that I learned the hard way with LAPS. We had implemented LAPS. We had gotten burnt on a pen test. Pen testers got domain admin. We got serious. We said, okay, we're going after it. We are going to win this next blue team, red team event. We deployed LAPS in a lot of environments. Everything looked good. You'd query Active Directory. It had a LAPS password. everything was good, but then you went to go use the password and the password wasn't working. So you go and you double check and make sure you're not typing it wrong, because we all know if we have used LAPS, that 1 and that L look very similar, and it gets me all the time. But something wasn't right. So I went back and I double checked the configuration. I started digging around online, happened upon an article where someone said that when I forced reset the value, all of a sudden the value synced and the password worked. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I tried it out. It worked on 3 servers. I said to myself, how am I going to do this on thousands of Windows servers? I'm not going to go issue a single command. So I came up with a tool, force reset LAPS. So this tool, let me go back 1 second here. If you're configuring LAPS and you see this password expires on December 31st of 1600, that means that the LAPS configuration is on the host, but the password hasn't synced. The admin PWD DLL has not synced that value with the local account. So this is where the force reset LAPS tool will come in handy. This is the single commandlet here, but essentially what you do is you gather, using PowerShell, you gather a collection of servers into an array, and then for each of these servers, you pass this command to the server. It will force reset the password, and at the next password policy, that value will sync, and you'll be able to access the host. Now, this may come in handy in an IR situation. Somehow, a red teamer enumerates that you have LAPS, they use a tool, they steal the value from a DLL in memory, and they get the password. Okay, how do you change that? You can still use force reset LAPS. Do yourself a favor. If you're doing this, let your SOC know. I made that mistake and got a phone call at 9 o'clock at night about, well, we noticed that a lot of passwords on localhost are changing. It had been a long week. And after about 20 minutes of realizing that I force reset the LAPS values, the incident was quickly resolved. But again, it comes down to that communication and doing yourself a favor and letting your SOC know. The benefits of LAPS: the value is encrypted in transit, but it's not encrypted at rest. What does that mean? That means if you're using a third-party LDAP viewer tool, and that LDAP viewer is querying server objects that have LAPS, that LAPS password can be disclosed in that traffic if you're not using LDAP-S. How can we maybe avoid this? We can use packet encryption with IPsec and Windows Firewall. You can make null encapsulation rules that encrypt the connections between each member server. That can help to obfuscate that traffic. It can be a little tricky to set up, but again, all about eliminating that risk. We can never be 100% secure. We can just slow down the threat actor, slow down the red teamer, and reduce that risk through layers as much as we can. Is there a better way to do this? I don't know, you tell me. Jason Fawson has a method that uses a certificate encrypted file. You can use a self-signed certificate, or you can use a certificate from your PKI. If you have a PKI, I recommend private key infrastructure or certificate authority server. I recommend doing that because then you can keep track of the cert. You can keep track of when the cert expires, manage it. So the idea is that the credential file for a host is encrypted with this certificate and stored on a network share. Now, the way that you set this up is really up to you, but that credential file can only be decrypted with the private key from the cert that it was encrypted with. So you can also set this up where different levels of sensitivity, you can have different certs. Then your staff only has access to the certs that they need to decrypt the credentials. This way, the credential file is on the host. If an attacker gets a hold of it, it's encrypted with SHA-256 encryption. And you can also leave the public key cert on the host, because if they get a hold of that, it's just the public key that encrypts the file. It's the private key that decrypts it. To mimic LAPS or kind of do that scheduled rotation, you set up a scheduled task on each host. And this is best for a work group environment. And then you encrypt it with a new value, and it archives it on a network share. Now it's available for retrieval if needed. And then you can also stick that private key onto a smart card or a YubiKey. So now you've added another layer of control for those credentials. Does not require a domain to use. There are definitely some holdbacks to lapse, a domain being one of them. So if you have a smaller environment, this may be something that you want to use. Jason Fawson is the author of the SANSEC 505 class. He puts all of his works in the public domain. So if you go to blueteampowershell.com, you can get this code will be in there and you can play around with it. As you see here, I mentioned we're talking about our renamed account. That's our administrator account that we renamed. The command is pretty simple. It's the update password archive script that Jason wrote. You provide the name, the path to the certificate, and then the path to the where you're going to store the encrypted credential file. It gets saved with a thumbprint of the cert. So when if you're going through to find, okay, hey, I've got this whole directory full of certs. How do I find the one I need? You can filter by the thumbprint. You then decrypt that file with the appropriate private key. You now see you've got your credential, the time stamp that it was saved at, and the host that it's for. And that's all done in memory. It doesn't get written to disk. These are all pulling things into memory. So when the garbage collector comes along, when this is done, that's not laying around for someone to use or share inadvertently. So let's talk about protected users. You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means, but we can turn the tables on them, right? We can make things harder. So protected users is Microsoft's answer to the wonderful legacy of NTLM and user credentials that they have created. So there's two phases of protection from an account that's in protected users. The first phase is on the domain controller, and that restricts the use of DES or RC4 encryption. So that will stop anything that uses Kerberos preauth. You may be interested to find that a lot of the Cisco products, including their web login for tools and TACX Plus, rely on basically pass the hash, LDAP plus NTLM with Kerberos preauth. So if you have that in your environment, protected users, you'd have to make a separate account for those network people. Moving on. It restricts the use of NTLM authentication. So it does stop CrackMap exec from pass the hash. It does not stop Mimikatz from overpass the hash, because that's creating a token in memory and then launching a process with the token. But authenticating to the domain controller with that NTLM credential will stop working. It also restricts the use of Kerberos delegation, whether constrained or unconstrained. And if you enjoy abusing Active Directory, you know that unconstrained delegation is, Alyssa Torres talked about Rubius. Take the ticket out of memory, inject the ticket into your session. If you've got host or you've got RPCSS, you can get code execution on that server that whatever account's ticket you took had unconstrained delegation. I know that sounds a little complicated, but that's what it means. Also, the Kerberos tickets for a protected user's member, you cannot renew the ticket, the ticket granting ticket for the user beyond the 4-hour lifetime. You have to create a new ticket, which means that you have to provide the credentials to the DC in order to get that new ticket granting ticket to provide to the ticket granting service. So that was a mouthful. There's a link here. You can read more about protected users. If you're going to do this in your domain, if you're already not doing it, start out with a small group of users and slowly move forward. If you find that you have some struggles, you can do two things. Figure out what technology is in place that is not cooperating with protected users, or you can make another account for these individuals, and that account would be in protected users to use the service that doesn't rely on NTLM, Kerberos preauth, things like that. So let's talk about device protections. Protected users eliminates the caching of credentials on a host, on an endpoint, on a laptop, on a server. This is very important. Creds in memory are how red teamers and threat actors, once they get a hold of memory, can get these NTLM hashes and can use these hashes in other ways, as we talked about, CrackMap exec, doing overpass the hash with Mimikatz. That's one of my favorite to do because it just pops a shell on your host as that user. Surprise. We'll also talk about NTLM will not cache plain text credentials in memory as well. So you won't see the hash, and you won't see that plain text. If you've ever used Mimikatz and you see the password and you're like, wow, is that really it? You won't see that anymore. What will this break? LDAP and NTLM authentication will no longer work. We say, so what? You'd be surprised at how many major name tools and products are basically doing pass the hash inside your environment. That's not good. Things need to change. We're looking at TACX Plus, the 20-year-old protocol using Kerberos pre-auth to access some of the most important devices on your network, like routers and switches, with the Cisco admin protocol. So that's me looking at you, Cisco. I should probably watch my back now. You can't be in danger if you are the danger. Protecting these administrative credentials is very important, right? Because as threat actors and red teamers move through the environment, that's what they're looking for. Sometimes that's that next step that they need to get to the end goal are those hashes in memory. And if you can do yourself a favor and limit that risk, you're going to be in a better place. It's not the end all be all. Protected users, you can still do protect with Mimikatz. You can still get the AES 256 key and pass the hash with that, because again, protected users is blocking NTLM pass the hash, but it's not blocking AES 256. Oh no, I've said too much. We need to get better. So weak password policies for administrative accounts. This is a slide. This is original work from something that is not mine. I have changed the values to protect the innocent. So let's look at this. We talk about checkbox compliance again. Let's talk about PCI, 7-character password policy. Oh, really? Here's a 7-character password policy with a special character. The password is clever. This is for landman authentication. The problem with Windows hashes is that they lack a salt. You don't know what a salt is or a salted hash, I'll tell you. A salt is a unique number that is mixed in with a mathematical formula with your password hash that would make your password, if we both had the password of clever exclamation point, your password hash and my password hash would look different with the salt. But Windows passwords do not have a salt. So one of the most dangerous password protocols, hashing protocols, is landman authentication. So we look here, this little example, it takes the password, it puts it to all uppercase. So if you're cracking hashes and you see that it's all in uppercase and it's a short password, chances are it's landman. It then takes and pads that value to 14. So that number 14 for landman is very important. We'll get to that. It splits that into 2 7-character chunks. It then takes and does a DES encryption string out of each of those chunks with the King's Guard station and our 5 favorite special characters. We take those 2 DES chunks and then stick them together. That is the landman hash. Now, I mentioned the 14 characters for landman. That comes into play very soon. You can see that it took me 1 second. I have a basic GPU, 1 second to crack that hash clever. So think about this. PCI DSS says 7-character password length is enough. If you were to install a Server 2019 Active Directory domain controller right now, does anybody know what the default password policy length is for that? The value is 7. That is the default for a domain controller. Still, that's not good. This here, 14 characters, 1 day, this needs to change, right? So we're going to talk about administrative fine-grained password policies. This is something that you can do either in PowerShell, command line, or it's easier to learn how to do through Active Directory Administration Center. So the important things for the administrator groups, these allow you to apply these to groups. So you can now apply this to a special group of admin users instead of your entire domain. Make the password length be 20 characters at a minimum. That makes these password hashes much more difficult to crack. The number of password history required, 5. And then also do not store password using reversible encryption. I've been a sysadmin for over 10 years. I can never remember a time that I had to use a password stored with reversible encryption. You don't need it, okay? Minimum password age. The important thing here for administrative users is enforce a lockout policy. I responded to an incident where the domain got compromised, not for the company that I work for, where the domain was compromised because the built-in administrator account did not have a lockout policy applied to it, and they had RDP exposed to the internet. Not a good situation. Also, you want to check until an administrator manually unlocks the account for your admin users. That's important. For your help, for your regular users, I talked about that number 14. 14 characters is the limit for Landman to create a hash. Make your password policy for your users 16 characters or more. That breaks Landman, cannot store that hash on a host, even if it wants to. Windows still does some tricky things sometimes. You can make the decision about how long you want to have the account locked out for based on how big your help desk is, what your threat model is, which Alyssa Miller talked about threat models. That's up to you, but you can apply this to a different group. It doesn't have to be the same, so you can have multiple fine-grained password policies in your environment to help fit the needs there. Please do this for your administrative users, and if your users do not have 16-character password policy, please change this. The complaining and griping that you'll hear from individuals who still have the same password that they've always used at 7 characters is a lot less painful than going through a major incident and ending up on the news. I can assure you that. You can enforce no LM hash, and this is all in the slides here, so I don't have to write it down. The slides are on GitHub and also in the chat. This will stop Landman from hashing a password value in the Landman algorithm. You then force change everybody's password. So if you have Landman passwords right now in your environment, or let me say this again, passwords that are under 14 characters and you want to remediate it, you want to go ahead and set this registry key on your host. You need to do testing first. Once this key is set, then you force password change all those accounts because they're new password that'll invalidate that current hash, and then they'll be forced to change to the higher password policy of 16 characters, thus removing you from LM twofold. Passwords over 15 characters break Landman hash. Passwords 20 characters in length become exponentially difficult to crack. With modern computing resources, this will change. Moore's law of technology says every 2 years, something becomes out of date or obsolete, GPUs included. Having a strong password policy. And then enforce that lockout threshold for admin accounts. That's so key. You also want to know if an admin is locking their accounts getting locked out 7 times in one day, you need to figure out what's going on. If you just have wait 15 minutes and it gets unlocked, that you could miss a really big indicator of compromise or odd behavior. And then password spray. Password spraying regularly to catch bad passwords. Shout out to Bo Bullock here for domain password spray. This is a lot of fun. You do need to be careful with this because you can lock out accounts. This tool will not spray accounts that are within the lockout threshold. But if that legitimate user then types a bad password, their account is then locked out. So be careful with it. But you should be able to detect a password spray. You should be able to detect a large volume, a spike of event 4625, which is logon failed, or 4624, which would be logon successful. Hopefully you don't see too many of those. But as you see here in our example, we're just using the password of password. And look at this. We have Tyler Durden has password. The Lazarus group, that's not supposed to be in here. Well, I guess you should have had that lockout policy on your administrator account. So passwords are like underpants. Change them often, keep them private, and never share them with anyone. And then to wrap things up here, I'd like to share something about limiting risk from EFS ransomware. I also took the SEC 505 class with Jason Fossen, and I thought that this was really sharp and is worth sharing today. So this is somewhat of a living off the land technique. EFS encryption is built into Windows, and it is something that can be used against you if you don't have a encrypted recovery cert set up. So how do you do that? How does that work? You set up this encrypted recovery cert and you assign it by policy. And what happens is at any time that EFS is used on a host in your domain, the private key of the cert that the threat actor, if they're using a certificate, the private key that they're using is encrypted with the public key of the recovery cert that you hold the private key to. So you can then decrypt and get that private key from the action of the EFS lockup. Now, you would have to maintain that if an threat actor got on and changed the recovery cert, basically invalidating your other one, that wouldn't work. But if you keep tabs on this, that could be an easy recourse. Again, not having to drop something into the environment to lock up your system, we'll just get domain admin and we'll use your tools against you. And so closing thoughts, what do we say to the God of death? We say not today. We can never keep our systems 100% secure, but there are a lot of things that we can do to limit that risk that we take on. And that's really part of the game, right? Is evaluating your threat model, limiting that risk, and monitoring your systems, right? We're never going to be able to stop threat actors or red teamers 100%. It's a cat and mouse game. But by doing the fundamentals and some of the things that I talked about in my presentation today, you can help to reduce that admin user risk in a Windows environment. Some acknowledgements: Jason Fawson, Black Hills Information Security, Wild West Hacking Fest. Really get a lot out of that. They have a great community. If you're not part of it, stick around in the Discord, reach out to some people. There's a lot of good people here that care and that will share knowledge with you. And if you're new to information security, you do belong here. If anybody tells you that you don't, they're wrong. Just remember that. You can do it if you have the passion and the critical thinking skills. And also, credit to Bo Bullock for Domain Password Spray. Great tool. And that's it. Thank you, Wild West Hacking Fest, for having me on today. And I really enjoyed this. Got a chance to speak to you all and hear all the great presentations so far. I am releasing a website here in the next month or so called blueteamtactics.net. We'll be talking about blue team, some carpentry, and barbecue. So check that out. And that's all I got.